The police officer's expression shifted the moment I showed him the spreadsheet. 23 pages of transactions, dates, account numbers, and proof that my own son-in-law had been stealing from me for 3 years. But that wasn't what made his jaw drop. It was when I showed him the second file, the one proving Brandon had done the exact same thing to his own mother before she died. Some predators don't hunt strangers. They hunt the people who love them most. But before we get into the story, please support us by liking and subscribing right now. I also want to say hi. Leave your name, city, and the word present in the comments. I want to know where you're listening from, even in faraway places. My name is Dorothy Mitchell. I'm 65 years old, and until 18 months ago, I thought I understood people. After all, I spent 37 years working at First National Bank in Richmond, Virginia. I started as a teller when I was 22, fresh out of community college with big dreams and sensible shoes. By the time I retired, I was the head of the fraud detection department. I'd seen every scam, every con, every trick desperate people use to steal money that doesn't belong to them. I thought I was immune. I thought my experience made me untouchable. Turns out, the most dangerous thieves don't wear masks or hack computers. They sit at your dinner table, call you mom, and ask how your day was. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My husband Walter passed away 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. By the time they found it, there was nothing to be done. 3 months from diagnosis to funeral. Walter was the love of my life. We met at a church picnic in 1982, got married 6 months later, and spent 40 years building a life together. He was a civil engineer, steady and reliable. The kind of man who fixed things before they broke and always remembered our anniversary. When he died, I thought the grief would kill me too. Some days, I wished it would. But I had our daughter, Melissa, and I had our savings. Walter and I had been careful our whole lives. We paid off our house in Henrico County. We maxed out our 401ks. We lived below our means and invested the difference. By the time Walter passed, between his life insurance, our retirement accounts, and the sale of his engineering firm shares, I had a little over $900,000. Not rich, but comfortable. Enough to live well, travel occasionally, and leave something for Melissa when I was gone. Melissa was our only child. She came late in our marriage. I was 38 when she was born, and the doctor said she was a miracle. Maybe that's why I spoiled her. Maybe that's why I never learned to tell her no. She grew up knowing she was wanted, cherished, adored. And she grew up beautiful with her father's kind eyes and my stubborn chin. She met Brandon Hayes at a marketing conference in Charlotte when she was 28. He was 32, handsome in that polished way that makes you think of cologne commercials and expensive watches. He had a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He laughed at all the right moments. He remembered names. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. I liked him immediately. God help me, I liked him more than I'd liked any of Melissa's previous boyfriends. He seemed solid, ambitious, the kind of man who would take care of my daughter the way Walter took care of me. They got married 2 years later in a beautiful ceremony at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. Walter walked Melissa down the aisle, tears streaming down his face. Brandon's vows made everyone cry. He promised to love her, protect her, and build a life worthy of her trust. I believed every word. After Walter died, Brandon stepped up in ways I hadn't expected. He helped me navigate the estate paperwork. He sat with me while I sorted through Walter's things. He drove me to appointments and made sure I was eating. Melissa was grieving too, overwhelmed with her own loss, and Brandon became my anchor. About 6 months after the funeral, he started asking about my finances. Not in a pushy way. Subtle, concerned. He'd mention that interest rates were terrible for savings accounts. He'd talk about investment opportunities his firm was exploring. He'd casually drop hints that my money could be working harder. I should have recognized the pattern. I'd seen it 1,000 times at the bank. The slow build-up, the establishment of trust, the gentle nudge toward financial discussions. But Brandon wasn't a stranger at the bank. He was family. He was the man who held my daughter's hand at her father's funeral. One evening over dinner at their house in Short Pump, Brandon made his pitch. He said he knew I was smart with money after all. I'd worked in banking my whole career. But the markets had changed. Traditional savings were losing value to inflation. He had connections with investment managers who could get me better returns, people he trusted with his own money. He showed me charts, projections, testimonials. He made it sound so reasonable, so safe. And the whole time, Melissa was nodding along, backing him up, telling me that Brandon had tripled their savings in 3 years. I said I'd think about it. That should have been the end of it. I should have politely declined, kept my money in my boring index funds and treasury bonds, and lived my quiet retirement in peace. But Brandon didn't let up. Every visit, every phone call, he'd mention it. Not aggressively, just persistently. and Melissa kept pushing too. Mom, Brandon just wants to help. He feels like you're part of his family now. Let him take care of you the way Dad would have wanted. The way Dad would have wanted. She knew exactly what buttons to push. 3 months after that dinner, I transferred $100,000 into an investment account Brandon had set up in my name. He showed me the paperwork. He explained every document. He answered every question. Everything looked legitimate. For the first few months, it seemed like I'd made the right decision. The statements showed steady growth. Brandon would call to update me, explaining which stocks had performed well, which sectors were heating up. The numbers kept climbing. I started to relax. Then the requests started. It was always something reasonable. A temporary transfer to take advantage of a time-sensitive opportunity. A short-term loan to close a deal that would benefit all of us. A minor adjustment that required moving funds between accounts. Brandon always had an explanation. Brandon always had documentation. And the statements always showed that my money was growing. I didn't realize what was actually happening until I noticed a discrepancy on one of the monthly statements. It was small, a transaction I didn't remember authorizing, a fee that seemed higher than usual. My old instincts kicked in. After 37 years of catching fraud, I knew that small discrepancies were often the first sign of big problems. I called the investment firm listed on the statement. The phone number went to a generic voicemail. I searched for the company online. The website existed, but something about it felt off. Stock photos that looked too perfect. Testimonials with no verifiable names, an address that turned out to be a UPS store in Roanoke. My stomach dropped. I drove to Melissa's house that evening without calling ahead. I found Brandon in his home office, and I asked him directly about the discrepancy. I watched his face carefully, using every skill I developed over decades of interviewing fraud suspects. He didn't miss a beat. He laughed, shook his head, and explained that the statement had a typo. Clerical error. He'd get it fixed right away. Then he pulled out his laptop and showed me the real numbers. My account was doing better than ever. I was being paranoid. Dorothy, I understand, he said, his voice warm and patient. After what you went through with Walter, it makes sense that you'd be anxious about money. But I promise you, everything is fine. More than fine. You're in great shape. He called Melissa into the room. She sat beside him, took his hand, and looked at me with concern. Not concern for my finances. Concern for my mental state. Mom, are you feeling okay? You seemed a little scattered lately. Have you talked to your doctor? Sometimes grief can affect our thinking in ways we don't realize. There it was. The pivot. The reframe. I wasn't a woman with legitimate questions. I was a confused widow, addled by grief, imagining problems that didn't exist. I went home that night and lay awake until dawn. Part of me wanted to believe Brandon. Part of me wanted to accept that I was being paranoid, that my experience at the bank had made me see thieves in shadows. But another part of me, the part that had caught hundreds of fraudsters, over 37 years, knew something was wrong. The next morning, I started digging. Friends, every story I tell you is released every day, but YouTube will only show them to you if you tap the red subscribe button. Please do it now while I'm speaking. Tap subscribe, turn on notifications, and you'll never miss a story. Have you done it yet? Thank you. I've always believed that the truth leaves tracks. Every lie requires another lie to support it. Every stolen dollar has to go somewhere. Every con artist, no matter how smart, eventually makes a mistake. The key is knowing where to look. I started with the basics. I requested copies of every statement from the investment firm Brandon had set up. I asked for transaction histories, fee schedules, account agreements. Brandon provided them all, cheerfully and promptly, which made me more suspicious, not less. Legitimate financial institutions have bureaucracy. They have waiting periods and verification processes. They don't produce detailed documents within hours of a request. The documents looked professional. That was the problem. They looked too professional, like someone had studied what real investment statements should look like and recreated them perfectly. The fonts were right. The logos were crisp. The numbers added up. But there were no FINRA registration numbers. No SEC filings. No independent verification of any kind. I opened a new email account that Brandon didn't know about. I started forwarding myself copies of everything. I created a spreadsheet and began logging every transaction, every date, every dollar amount. I cross-referenced the statements Brandon gave me with my actual bank. Records the accounts I still controlled, the ones he hadn't touched. The discrepancies multiplied. Money that was supposed to be invested in growth funds had actually been transferred to accounts I'd never heard of. Dividends that should have been reinvested had vanished entirely. The fees Brandon mentioned were 3 times higher than industry standards. And there were withdrawals, dozens of them, that I had never authorized. I wasn't paranoid. I was being robbed. But I needed more proof. I needed to understand the full scope of what Brandon had done. And I needed to do it without alerting him. If he realized I was investigating, he'd cover his tracks. He'd move the money. He'd destroy evidence. I'd seen it happen before. Suspects who sensed the investigation closing in and managed to disappear everything before we could catch them. So I played along. I called Brandon and apologized for my behavior at their house. I said he was right. I had been anxious, paranoid, not thinking clearly. I asked him to explain the investment strategy again slowly, so I could understand it better. I told him I was considering adding more money to the account. His voice brightened immediately. Of course he'd explain everything. Of course he'd help me understand. And yes, adding more money was a great idea. The markets were favorable. This was the perfect time to maximize my returns. I listened carefully, taking notes, recording the call on my phone. He talked for 45 minutes about market trends and diversification strategies, and compound growth. He used all the right jargon. He sounded completely convincing. If I hadn't already seen the evidence, I might have believed him. At the end of the call, I told him I'd think about adding another 100,000. He said that would be wonderful. He said he was glad I was trusting him again. He said I was like a mother to him. I hung up and cried. Not because I was sad. Because I was furious. This man had looked me in the eyes, held my hand at my husband's funeral, and systematically stolen everything I'd worked my entire life to build. And he'd done it while smiling. The investigation took 3 months. I treated it like any case at the bank, methodical, thorough, documented. I traced every dollar Brandon had moved. I identified the shell accounts he'd used to hide the transfers. I found the properties he purchased with my money: a vacation condo in Myrtle Beach, a boat registered in North Carolina, a portfolio of stocks held in his own name. He'd stolen for $127,000 from me, nearly half of everything Walter and I had saved. But that wasn't the worst discovery. One night, while searching for information about Brandon's financial history, I found an obituary. Margaret Hayes, age 71, of Greensboro, North Carolina. Brandon's mother. She had died 4 years earlier, just 18 months before Brandon married Melissa. I read the obituary 3 times. Margaret had been a retired school teacher, a widow, a devoted mother to her only son. The obituary described her as generous and trusting. It mentioned that she'd struggled financially in her final years. Something about that phrase nagged at me. A retired school teacher who struggled financially. Teachers don't make millions, but they have pensions. They have benefits. They have Social Security. Why would Margaret Hayes have struggled? I started digging. It took 2 weeks to find what I was looking for. Margaret Hayes had owned a house in Greensboro that was valued at over $300,000. She'd had a pension worth $2,000 a month. She'd had savings accounts, retirement funds, everything a careful woman accumulates over a lifetime of work. When she died, she had nothing. The house had been sold. The accounts had been drained. The pension payments had been redirected to an account controlled by her son, the same son who would later marry my daughter and offered to help manage my investments. Brandon had stolen from his own mother. He'd taken everything she had. And when she died, penniless and alone, he'd moved on to his next victim. Me. I sat at my kitchen table with the evidence spread around me, and I understood for the first time exactly who my son-in-law was. Not a bad man who made a mistake. Not a desperate person driven by circumstances. Brandon was a predator. He targeted vulnerable women, widows, mothers, people who trusted him because he positioned himself as family. He'd done it before. He would do it again. Unless someone stopped him. I picked up the phone and called Detective Angela Moretti at the Richmond Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. I'd worked with Angela years ago on a fraud case that crossed into criminal territory. She was smart, thorough, and she didn't suffer fools. When I told her what I'd found, she went quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised me. "Dorothy, I need you to keep acting normal. Don't confront him. Don't tell your daughter. Don't do anything different. If we move too fast, he'll run. These guys always do. Can you do that?" I told her I could. Good. Now tell me everything. Detective Moretti sent 2 officers to my house the next day. They weren't in uniform, just a man and woman in business casual, carrying laptops and notepads. They introduced themselves as specialists in financial crimes and elder abuse. They sat at my dining room table for 4 hours while I walked them through everything I'd found. They took my spreadsheets, my bank records, my recorded phone calls. They asked questions I hadn't thought to consider about Brandon's work history, his relationships, his previous addresses. They cross-referenced his Social Security number with databases I didn't have access to. The picture that emerged was worse than I'd imagined. Brandon Hayes had been doing this for over a decade. Before his mother, there had been another victim, an elderly aunt in Tennessee who died with nothing in her accounts. Before that, a former employer who'd been convinced to invest in one of Brandon's businesses and lost $50,000. The pattern was always the same: charm, trust, small requests that grew larger, and a slow, systematic drain of assets. He'd never been caught because his victims were either dead or too ashamed to come forward. Financial abuse thrives in silence. People don't want to admit they've been conned, especially by family. They blame themselves. They make excuses. They hope the situation will somehow resolve itself. I refused to be silent. The investigation expanded. Detective Moretti brought in the FBI because the crimes crossed state lines. They subpoenaed records from banks in Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. They traced money through shell companies and offshore accounts. They built a case so airtight that even Brandon's expensive lawyers wouldn't be able to punch holes in it. But the hardest part wasn't cooperating with the police. The hardest part was facing my daughter. Melissa called me 3 times a week, chattering about her life, her job, her plans with Brandon. She talked about the vacation they were planning to Costa Rica. She mentioned the new car Brandon was thinking about buying. She described the dinner parties they hosted for his business associates. I listened to all of it, knowing that the vacation was being paid for with my stolen money, that the new car would be purchased with funds he'd taken from a dead woman's pension, that his business associates were probably his next marks. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to shake her and demand to know how she couldn't see what was right in front of her face. But Detective Moretti had been clear. Any warning would tip Brandon off. He'd disappear. He'd take the money and run to somewhere without extradition treaties, and I'd never see justice. So I bit my tongue. I smiled when they came to visit. I pretended everything was normal. It was the hardest acting job of my life. The investigation took for months. For months of lies, of pretending, of watching Brandon treat me like a beloved mother-in-law, while knowing he'd stolen nearly $500,000 from me. For months of listening to Melissa praise her wonderful husband, while my evidence folder grew thicker by the day. Then, one Tuesday morning in March, Detective Moretti called. "We're ready," she said. "The warrants are signed. We're moving today." I asked if I should be there. "No. Stay home. We'll call you when it's done." I spent the next 6 hours sitting by the phone, unable to eat, unable to think about anything except what was happening across town. I imagined Brandon's face when the officers arrived. I imagined Melissa's confusion, her disbelief, her inevitable denial. At 3:47 p.m. my phone rang. "It's done. We have him in custody." I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Then Moretti continued, "There's something else you should know. When we executed the search warrant, we found additional evidence. It looks like he was planning to accelerate his timeline with you. He had forged documents ready power of attorney forms, beneficiary changes, property transfers. If you hadn't come to us when you did." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Brandon had been planning to take everything. Not just my savings, but my house, my remaining investments, my social security checks. He was going to drain me completely, just like he'd done to his mother. And then what? What happens to elderly women who've been stripped of everything by the people they trusted most? I didn't want to think about it. The call from Melissa came an hour later. She was hysterical, sobbing, barely able to form coherent sentences. Something about a mistake, about the police being wrong, about Brandon being innocent. She begged me to help, to use my connections at the bank to clear everything up. I let her talk herself out. Then, as calmly as I could manage, I told her the truth. I told her about the discrepancies I'd found, about the fake investment company, about the $427,000 her husband had stolen from me, about his mother in Greensboro, dead and penniless, about the pattern of fraud that stretched back more than a decade. Silence. "Mom, that can't be right. Brandon would never." "Melissa, I have the records. I have bank statements, transaction histories, recorded phone calls. I have evidence that would stand up in any court." I didn't want to believe it either. But the truth is the truth. More silence. Then, in a voice I barely recognized, Melissa said, "You're lying. You've always been jealous of our relationship. You never thought Brandon was good enough for me. You're making this up to destroy my marriage." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Melissa, I'm not. Don't call me. Don't come to my house. I can't believe you would do this to your own daughter." She hung up. I stared at my phone for a long time. I'd expected denial. I prepared myself for it. But hearing those words from my only child, the daughter I'd loved more than my own life, cut deeper than anything Brandon had done. If you want to know how the story ends and discover many more, hit the red subscribe button. It's free and it helps me a lot. The weeks after Brandon's arrest were the loneliest of my life. Lonelier than the days after Walter died. Lonelier than the months of secret investigation. Because at least during those times I'd had hope. Hope that the truth would set things right. Hoped that my daughter would see clearly once the evidence was presented. I was wrong. Melissa refused to speak to me. She posted Brandon's bail using their joint savings money that was almost certainly stolen from somewhere. She hired a defense attorney, a flashy guy from Washington, D.C., who specialized in getting guilty people acquitted. She stood by her husband with a ferocity that broke my heart. I understood in a distant way. Melissa had built her entire life around Brandon. Her identity, her sense of self, her vision of the future, all of it was intertwined with this man she'd married. To accept that he was a criminal meant accepting that everything she believed about her life was a lie. That's not an easy thing to do. Most people would rather double down on denial than face that kind of reckoning. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. The trial was scheduled for October. The prosecutor's office assigned an assistant DA named Richard Humphreys to the case. He was mid-50s, experienced, the kind of lawyer who'd seen everything and was surprised by nothing. He walked me through what to expect. The defense will try to paint you as confused, he warned. They'll suggest that you misunderstood the investment arrangement. They might imply that your age is affecting your judgment. They'll do everything they can to make the jury doubt you. I smiled grimly. They can try. Humphreys raised an eyebrow. You seem confident. I spent 37 years catching people like Brandon. I know how they operate. I know how they think. And I've documented everything. He nodded slowly. I read your file. The work you did, the investigation, the documentation, it's impressive. The FBI agents said they've rarely seen a civilian build a case this thorough. I wasn't going to let him get away with it. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Brandon's defense attorney was as good as his reputation. He was smooth, articulate, and masterful at creating reasonable doubt. He suggested that the investment losses were legitimate market downturns. He implied that my grief over Walter had affected my perception. He produced character witnesses, who described Brandon as a loving husband, a devoted son-in-law, a man incapable of fraud. Then it was my turn to testify. I sat in that witness box for 3 days. 3 days of questions, cross-examination, attempts to rattle me. The defense attorney tried every trick in the book. He asked me about my age, my health, my mental state. He suggested that I'd made mistakes in my documentation. He implied that I was motivated by resentment toward my son-in-law. I answered every question calmly and precisely. I walked the jury through my spreadsheets, my bank records, my recorded phone calls. I explained exactly how Brandon's scheme had worked, the shell companies, the forged documents, the systematic transfers. I showed them the evidence connecting him to his mother's financial ruin. And when the defense attorney suggested that I was just a confused old woman who didn't understand modern investing, I looked him straight in the eye. Sir, I spent 37 years as a head of fraud detection at First National Bank. I've testified as an expert witness in over 40 financial crimes cases. I've trained FBI agents on how to identify Ponzi schemes. I am not confused. I am not mistaken. And I am not a fool. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Brandon's face when the verdict was read, I'll never forget it. The charm vanished. The smooth exterior cracked. For the first time, I saw the real person underneath, angry, bitter, and utterly devoid of remorse. Melissa was sitting in the gallery behind him. When the foreman announced the verdict, she collapsed. Not literally, but something in her seemed to break. She stared at Brandon like she was seeing him for the first time. The sentencing hearing was a month later. The prosecutor requested the maximum 15 years for the federal charges, additional time for the state crimes, full restitution. Brandon's attorney asked for leniency, citing his client's lack of prior convictions and his family responsibilities. The judge wasn't moved. Mr. Hayes, you systematically targeted vulnerable women, your own mother among them, and stole their life saving. As through manipulation and deceit, you exploited their trust, their grief, and their love. You showed no mercy to your victims, and I see no reason to show mercy to you. 12 years in federal prison. Full restitution ordered, though we all knew I'd never see most of that money again. It was gone, spent on the lifestyle Brandon had built on stolen funds. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. Mostly, I just felt tired. After the sentencing, I went home and sat in Walter's chair. I hadn't sat there since he died. It always felt like an intrusion, like I was taking something that wasn't mine. But that night, I needed to feel close to him. I thought about everything that had happened. The money I'd lost over $400,000, nearly half my savings. The daughter who'd chosen her criminal husband over her own mother. The years of my retirement that had been consumed by investigation and trial instead of travel and relaxation. Was it worth it? I didn't know. I still don't. What I knew was that Brandon Hayes would never hurt another woman the way he'd hurt me and his mother. He was in prison, marked as a convicted felon, his face in databases that track financial predators. Even if he got out in 8 years with good behavior, He'd never again be able to charm his way into a vulnerable woman's bank account. That had to count for something. 3 weeks after the sentencing, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Melissa standing on my porch. She looked terrible, thinner than I'd ever seen her, dark circles under her eyes, her hair unwashed and pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was holding a manila envelope. We stared at each other for a long moment. "Mom," she said. Can I come in?" I stepped aside. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd built the case against her husband. She didn't speak for a long time, just sat there, staring at her hands, tears sliding down her cheeks. Finally, she looked up. "I'm sorry." 2 words. I'd been waiting months to hear them. Now that they were here, I didn't know what to feel. "I didn't believe you," she continued. "I couldn't believe you. Because if you were right, then everything I knew about my life was wrong. Every memory I had of Brandon, every moment we shared, every time he told me he loved me, it was all a lie. I couldn't face that. So I made you the enemy instead." She pushed the manila envelope across the table. "The divorce papers. I filed last week. I'm not asking for anything. The house, the cars, the accounts, I don't want any of it. It's all blood money." I opened the envelope. The papers were there, Melissa's signature already on the relevant pages. "Where will you go?" I asked. "I don't know. I was hoping." She trailed off, biting her lip. "Hoping what? I don't have any right to ask this. After everything I said to you, everything I put you through. But I don't have anywhere else to go. Brandon isolated me from my friends. He made me dependent on him. I don't have a job. I don't have savings. I don't have anything." She was crying harder now. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I was so stupid. I loved him, and he made me believe that you were the problem. Every time you questioned him, he'd twist it around, make it seem like you were jealous or confused or trying to control me. And I believed him. I believed him because I wanted to. Because it was easier than seeing the truth." I reached across the table and took her hand. "Melissa, you're my daughter. That doesn't stop being true just because we go through hard times." She looked up at me, hope and shame warring in her eyes. "You can stay here," I said, "for as long as you need. We'll figure out the rest together." She broke down completely then, sobbing like a child, all the walls she built crumbling at once. I held her the way I'd held her when she was small. When a nightmare could be chased away with a hug and a glass of warm milk, some nightmares take longer to wake up from. But we wake up eventually. The months that followed were not easy. Melissa moved into her old room, the one she'd had as a teenager. We fell into an uneasy rhythm, learning how to be mother and daughter again after everything that had happened. There were hard conversations. Nights when Melissa would ask me, "How did I not see it?" And I had no good answer. Mornings when the silence between us was thick with unspoken pain. Moments when I caught her looking at her phone, waiting for a message from a husband who was behind bars. Recovery isn't linear. I learned that with Walter's death, and I learned it again with this. There are good days and bad days, progress and setbacks. The only thing you can do is keep moving forward. Melissa got a job at a nonprofit downtown, working with victims of domestic abuse. I think it helped her to channel her experience into something useful. She understood manipulation now in a way she never had before. She could recognize the signs, the patterns, the slow erosion of identity that predators use to trap their victims. "I was so lucky," she told me one evening. "Brandon took your money, but he didn't take your life." His mother wasn't so fortunate. We learned more about Margaret Hayes during the trial. She hadn't just died broke. She died alone, in a nursing home Brandon had chosen specifically because it was 3 hours from any of her friends or family. He'd isolated her, just like he'd tried to isolate me. Just like he'd started to isolate Melissa. The prosecutor had called it a pattern. The judge had called it predatory. I called it evil. About 6 months after Melissa moved in, I received a letter. It came in a plain white envelope with a federal prison return address. I knew what it was before I opened it. Brandon wanted to explain. He wanted me to understand that he wasn't a bad person, just someone who'd made mistakes. He wanted me to know that he still loved Melissa, that he thought about her every day. He asked me to encourage her to visit him, to give him a chance to make things right. I read the letter twice, then fed it into the shredder. Some people are beyond redemption. Not because forgiveness isn't possible, but because they don't actually want it. Brandon wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry he got caught. There's a difference. Melissa asked me about the letter later. She'd seen the federal envelope in the trash. "He wrote to you, yes? What did he say?" "Nothing worth repeating." She nodded slowly. "He's written to me too. Every week since he was sentenced. I haven't opened any of them." "What do you do with them?" "Burn them. In the backyard in the fire pit Dad built." I smiled despite myself. Walter had built that fire pit the summer before he got sick. He'd been so proud of it, so excited about the family gatherings we'd have around it. That seems appropriate, I said. Mom, yes? Thank you. For not giving up. For seeing the truth when I couldn't. For being willing to take me back after everything I said. I pulled her into a hug. That's what mothers do. A year after Brandon's conviction, I got a call from Detective Moretti. She had news. The FBI had continued investigating after the trial. They traced Brandon's financial activities back further than we'd originally known. It turned out he'd been running variations of his scheme for almost 20 years, starting when he was barely out of college. His first victim had been a professor who'd mentored him, then an elderly neighbor, then a woman he'd dated briefly, then his aunt, then his mother, then me. 7 confirmed victims, over $2 million stolen in total. 3 of the victims had died before they could see justice. 2 others had refused to cooperate with the investigation. Too ashamed to admit what had happened, I was the one who'd finally stopped him. Moretti told me that the FBI was using my case as a training example. The documentation I'd compiled, the methodical way I'd built the evidence, the patience I'd shown in not confronting Brandon until the case was airtight. All of it was being studied by agents learning to investigate financial crimes. You should be proud, Moretti said. What you did wasn't easy. Most people in your situation would have confronted him immediately, or just tried to forget about it, or blamed themselves. You treated it like a professional case. You did the work. And because of that, he's behind bars. I thanked her for the call. After we hung up, I sat for a long time, thinking about everything. Was I proud? I suppose I was. But mostly I was sad. Sad for Margaret Hayes, who died alone because her son couldn't be trusted. Sad for the other victims, the ones who'd been too ashamed to come forward. Sad for Melissa, who lost years of her life to a man who saw her as nothing more than a tool for accessing her mother's money. And sad for myself, if I'm honest. Because even though I'd won, I'd also lost. Lost money I'd never get back. Lost years of peaceful retirement. Lost the relationship I thought I had with my son-in-law. The happy family I thought we built. The truth is patient, they say. It can wait longer than any lie. Maybe so. But patience has a price. Sometimes the truth arrives too late to undo the damage. Sometimes all you can do is pick up the pieces and try to build something new from what's left. That's what I've been doing. It's been 2 years now since Brandon's sentencing. Melissa is still living with me, though she's been saving money and talks about getting her own place soon. I've encouraged her to take her time. There's no rush. The house is big enough for both of us, and I've grown used to having someone to share meals with again. My finances have stabilized. I'll never get back what Brandon stole, but I have enough to live comfortably. I sold some things I didn't need anymore: Walter's car, some jewelry I never wore, the storage unit full of stuff we'd accumulated over 40 years of marriage. It was painful at first letting go, but I've learned that possessions are just possessions. What matters is the people around us and the choices we make. I started volunteering at a senior center downtown, teaching financial literacy classes, how to spot scams, how to protect your assets, how to recognize the warning signs of fraud. I share my story with every class, and I see the recognition in their eyes. So many of them have been targeted too. So many of them are afraid to speak up. Don't be ashamed, I tell them. These people are professionals. They know exactly how to exploit trust. The only way to fight them is to talk about it, to warn others, to refuse to stay silent. Some of them have come to me after class with their own stories. A nephew who borrowed money and never paid it back. A caregiver who was skimming from the grocery budget. A financial advisor who charged hidden fees. I've helped a few of them file reports, navigate the system, fight back. It's not enough to undo the damage that's been done, but it's something. Last month, I got a letter from the FBI. They wanted to give me an award, something they do for civilians who've made significant contributions to criminal investigations. The ceremony was in Washington, D.C., at the J. Edgar Hoover Building. Melissa came with me. Standing at that podium, accepting a plaque I hadn't asked for and didn't need, I thought about Walter. I thought about our 40 years together, the life we built, the dreams we shared. I thought about how he would have reacted to everything that happened: the theft, the investigation, the trial, the aftermath. He would have been furious at Brandon. He would have been heartbroken about Melissa. And he would have been proud of me. The truth is patient, I said in my acceptance speech. It can wait longer than any lie. But it can't wait forever. Eventually, the lies run out. Eventually, the truth catches up. And when it does, you have to be ready to act. I looked out at the audience: FBI agents, prosecutors, victim advocates, Melissa in the front row with tears in her eyes. I'm 67 years old. I spent my whole career catching fraudsters, and I still got fooled by someone I trusted. That's how good these people are. That's how dangerous they can be. But I refuse to be a victim. I refuse to stay silent. And I refuse to let him win. I held up the plaque. This isn't for me. It's for every woman who's been stolen from by someone she loved. For every person who's been made to feel crazy for asking questions. For every victim who's been silenced by shame. Your truth matters. Your voice matters. And if you're willing to fight, I promise you justice is possible. The applause was long and loud. But honestly, I barely heard it. I was thinking about Walter. About Margaret Hayes. About all the women whose stories we'll never know because they died before anyone believed them. I was thinking about my daughter, sitting in the front row, finally free from the man who'd manipulated her for years. And I was thinking about the future, the classes I'd teach, the people I'd help, the truth I'd keep telling until there was no breath left in my body. Some stories end with justice. Some end with loss. This one ends with both. But if I've learned anything from the last 2 years, it's that endings are also beginnings. The chapter closes, but the book continues. And as long as there are predators in the world, there need to be people willing to hunt them. That's what I am now. A hunter. And I'm just getting started. If you enjoyed the story, click subscribe and tell me in the comments what part impressed you. There's more tomorrow. See you there.